This tank chat's going to be about this vehicle, the Matilda 1, or A11 as it was known as, the very first British infantry tank. Now, the Matilda 1 is a tank that only sees a very short amount of action in the spring of 1940, but the one battle that it's engaged in, the Battle of Arras, in May of 1940, has enormous significance, not just for the British Army, but the whole history of Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany. So even though many people almost dismiss this vehicle, it's often ridiculed as being too small, undergunned, etc., etc. It has its moment in a way that few other tanks do in the whole of the Second World War. So I'd consider it a really important bit of kit. Now, as ever with this, let's go back in time first of all to have a little look at why the Matilda comes about. The tank has shown some of its sort of potential in the First World War, but it hasn't really come to its full potential. It's not really shown what it can do. And because of that, in the 20s and 30s, some countries, they think, no, it's only going to be good for that type of war. Will we have that type of war ever again? So they dismiss the tank. In Britain, of course, we've seen in other tank chats, we progress with vehicles such as the Vickers Medium. And there's a school of thought that says maybe using an all-armoured force into something like a tank brigade or even an armoured division, that can create manoeuvre on a battlefield, wide sweeps of action, and bring a sense of mobility back to military forces that was so sadly lacking in so much of the First World War, certainly on the Western Front, that static warfare. By the end of the 1920s in Britain, we've had experiments up on Salisbury Plain where the mechanised force, they're showing the potential of what those Vickers mediums can do, what lorry-borne infantry, track vehicles towing some sort of artillery, etc. All of this mechanised force shows off the potential of armour and the tank potentially for the future. Now, the Royal Tank Corps is arguing for a better tank than the Vickers Medium. And in the background, we've talked about Independent already. Do we go for a land battleship as a sort of huge, great replacement for that First World War type of warfare? Do we do it in a different way? Do we go for a lighter tank as a cruiser tank to, again, manoeuvre across the battlefield? But there's still people arguing we're going to need smaller, lighter vehicles to help support the infantry in that traditional role that they were used in the First World War to get across the battlefield and help take on enemy targets, whether that's a machine gun nest, cross trenches, etc. So the infantry can advance. Now, those arguments are raging between a bunch of theorists. The chief of the defence staff, he's very sympathetic, Milne, his name. He likes the idea of being very progressive. But even the Tank Corps and those who are arguing for the use of mechanised forces, even they can't quite make up their minds about what they actually want. And then amongst all of this situation, 1930 and the Great Depression. And you cannot overemphasize how the lack of money suddenly stymies lots of developmental issues, new tanks. The Royal Tank Corps wanted this tank called the 16-tonner, too expensive. Quite simply, that program is dropped because of lack of money. Each of those 16-tonner tanks was going to, they estimated, cost about £16,000. A lot of money back then. And the budgets for the military in 1931, they're cut from about 40 million for the army down to 36 million. And that money's not replaced until about 1934. Does it finally creep up again to that pre-crash sort of prices or that sort of budget they were given? So that has to be borne in mind when people are coming together to say, we've still got to build something, the military's going to need some form of tanks, but we just don't really have the money to go for the tanks we might want to. Now, at this time, there's something called the Experimental Committee, that's a subcommittee of the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. He sits on this committee, and Percy Hobart, a name that's very familiar, in his role, he comes forward and basically says, look, I will summarise some of the tank thought that's going on in regards to supporting the infantry. We could go down the route of something smaller and lighter. We make them in larger numbers. They support the infantry across what was known as a shell-torn area. They would be carrying things such as machine guns, maybe even equipment for the infantry that helps them on the advance and suppresses enemy fire. We could also go for a heavy option to support the infantry, thicker armour on the vehicle, a cannon of some sort to attack the machine gun that the phrase was that was under armour. Now, whether that was defensive positions like pillboxes or under armour, i.e. on another military vehicle like a tank. But the idea, again, thick armour. Up to this point in the early 1930s, the maximum armour on a vehicle has been about 14 millimetres. So 14 millimetres, not that thick, and they're now saying we think we want about an inch, something along those lines to stop what is bound to be an awful lot of fire coming your way as you're advancing ahead of the infantry. You are bound to draw fire. And they're also saying we only probably want something along the lines of about 8 miles an hour maximum speed because, again, think of the role. You're there with the infantry, even if they're trying to belt across the battlefield, they're not going to be going much more than about 4 miles an hour. Marching pace is normally considered 3 miles an hour. So you're leading the infantry on the attack, you're going to need some sort of protection. So that debate about shall we go for something bigger, heavier, or something potentially smaller, lighter, that debate's already there. It's being debated at that high level. Then we get another figure enters the fray, which is Hugh Ellis. He was in charge of the Tank Corps back in the First World War, familiar name to those of you who like your First World War tanks issues. He comes along and he's made something called Master General of Ordnance. And so he, in essence, is being put in charge of pushing forward whatever equipment the army's going to be wanting. And he's coming with his memories of the First World War, and he argues strongly that, yes, we're going to need what becomes known as an infantry tank, that tank to support the infantry, as they did in the First World War, lead it across the battlefield, crush wire, suppress machine guns, and then let the infantry follow on. He's not adverse to other types of tanks. They're still experimenting with the Independent. They're looking at developing the A9, the A10 cruiser programs. Those will be the tanks that will speed ahead once a gap is developed in an enemy frontline position. But he argues strongly we've got to get going on an effective infantry tank. And that first project that he supports becomes the A11, the Matilda 1 tank that I'm standing next to right now. He also starts at the same time in parallel a similar program for a heavy tank that becomes the A12. We know it as a Matilda 2, but the emphasis is put on A11 Matilda 1 first. The Matilda 2 design work, things start in the background, but they've got to get going with vehicles coming out earlier on for that A11 vehicle that way. So Ellis is made Master General of the Ordnance in May of 1934. Very quickly, they start working up a specification for the new vehicle, bearing in mind Ellis is coming along now saying, you're going to get things like anti-tank guns on the battlefield. There's an awareness. There's even a worry that the anti-tank gun has almost got the measure of the future of the tank on the battlefield. We'll see that a bit later in the 30s, where there's a reaction as well about mines. Is that going to be the end of the tank if they can put minefields out all over the place? But Ellis is arguing 20, 37 millimetre, 40 millimetre anti-tank guns. This new vehicle has got to be proof against it. And so straight away, they're starting to look at around 60 millimetres of armour protection as being needed to make that vehicle somehow be able to survive if it's leading the infantry forward. They're looking at weaponry. Because it's supporting the infantry, they're calling this a man-killing vehicle. It's not a tank-on-tank vehicle, so they're going to give it a 303 machine gun. They think that for the specification will be quite good enough, and they would like it to be able to cross about a 6-foot wide trench. And the argument is, number one, we don't really have much money, but what money we have, we are going to spend on as many of these as we can get for our money rather than actually going towards the high-end product all the time. So keep the budget down. That's what's important from that point of view. 10th of October 1935, the Assistant Director of Mechanisation, who's a chap called Colonel Studd, goes to have a sit down with Sir John Carden. And Carden is the fellow who's been designing tanks for Vickers. Now, again, step back a second. Vickers in the 1920s are the company you go to buy tanks. And Vickers have done quite well. They've pushed their own Vickers medium. The Army likes that in the early 1920s. They're also able to develop vehicles on behalf of the British military where they learn lots of lessons and they can use that for their own commercial product. And they're very good. They've been an arms manufacturer for many years. They're very good at being able to find a simple, a cheap version of something that they can sell around the world to many other markets. So the famous example, 1928, along comes the Vickers 6-tonner. Ironically, not bought by the Army, even though it becomes, the basis of Polish, Russian, so many countries' tank industries. So they're very good that way of being able to sell material on. And Sir John Carden, basically the guys at Vickers are the only ones left in the UK that have a tank design office and a capacity to pretty much build any type of tank. We've closed down after the war the government's tank design office at Woolwich that way. So Sir John Carden, he's the name to deal with. And Colonel Studd, Sir John Carden, they sit down and they come up with the proposal for Matilda I to match those specifications the General Staff has come out with. And amazingly, Carden's note from that meeting still exists. And it's worth just having a quick look at. And on camera, of course, we can actually look at this note because he writes down things that we now know are quite important. The code word for this vehicle, the code word is going to be called Matilda. Nothing about what it's going to look like in the future, just a given code word for Vickers to actually remember that way. Development costs are going to be £15,000. He's written that and underlined that there. They really would like the idea of a prototype in 6 months, if at all possible. They're talking about, ideally, speed between 5 and 8 miles an hour. It needs a machine gun, 1303, maybe about 3,000 rounds of ammunition there as well. And there's other little parts of the notes, including keeping this secret and maybe keeping it away from some of the tank guys at the moment. Otherwise, we'll have so many fingers trying to put their little marker on what this tank's going to come out like. And Sir John Carden as well, one of the things he says is, give me free rein. Give me the chance to go away and come up with something without everybody second guessing it all the time. And very quickly, he's got a drawing that looks surprisingly similar to the Matilda I tank that actually comes out at the end of all this. So 2 months later, Sir John Carden, he gets killed in an air crash. We lose that skill set. And he's also working on the cruiser tanks with Vickers for the British military, etc. Again, another one of these, sometimes people ask, if he'd survived, it was a civil airliner that went down, if he'd survived, maybe that would be another thing that British tank design may have progressed in a slightly different way, because he's certainly the one person in the country that has the genius about tanks at this time.
This video has been made possible by our supporters on Patreon, our YouTube members, and our Super Thanks donors. Please join them if you can, and support the Tank Museum. And thanks for watching.
The first pilot model of the Matilda I, they called it the A11E1, is actually delivered to the Mechanical Warfare Experimental Establishment. That's in about September of 1936, where straight away trialling begins. They are aiming to do about 800 miles on this vehicle cross-country, maybe about 200 miles on roads. Inevitably, in such a short space of time, there's teething troubles. But actually, if you look overall, the trials go actually very, very well. One of the problems they've got with is the manganese steel track, the track pins. I think it's something like just under 500 miles are covered. 57 track pins are broken in that time. So they've got to find ways of strengthening certain area. Suspension gets a bit of attention. You've got a suspension that they're actually taking from the light Mark IV Dragon, that sort of towing vehicle. The track system really comes from that. And also you'll see very much similarities with the Vickers export tank, the track that's used and the suspension road wheel system that's used on that. So one of the things Sir John Carden, to meet a quick deadline, has done is he's specified materials that are already available. So the engine, for example, it's a Ford V8 3.6 litre engine, something called the Model 79, gives about 70 horsepower. That's really, in essence, a commercial engine they're using here. Fordson tractor gearbox goes behind it. So again, they're using things, keep pushing forward. We need to get these tanks into production in as short a time as possible. And there's another driver there, not just the money. He estimates £5,000 a tank. Not too bad going in terms of the cost for each of those, but also we've actually got to meet a schedule of getting them to the troops. Because only think about this, from 34 onwards, we're looking at that first delivery of that prototype in 1936. Already Europe is starting to, Britain is starting to do a major rearmament program for the middle of the 1930s. And again, I always say this one because again, we can lose it in the bigger picture. Most of the rearmament money is going towards the Navy and the Air Force. They're seen as the key priorities. The Army is kind of last resort as a measure that way. So we've done away with that 10-year rule in 1932. We are starting from 34 to put a bit more money into things, but money's still tight, certainly for the armies and for tanks that way. So when we're looking at this, how this vehicle's developed, it's taken down in December of 1936 down the road here to Lulworth, where people like Hobart, Martel, some of the big names in the tank corps, big names in tank development have shown it. Much to everyone's surprise, actually in the paperwork, there's not savage criticisms about the vehicle because, you know, it doesn't take a genius to see this looks like a relatively modest looking tank with only a .303 machine gun. Already there's arguments about firepower being paramount on any armoured vehicle, that, you know, the debate's still going on there. But actually people like Hobart, Martel, all their own criticisms that are actually recorded tend to be about visibility for the driver and the commander. And that is actually, you see that through in some of the issues of how Vickers are trying to compensate or adjust to some of the problems that are coming out on trials. Another one of the issues that comes out on trials is bullet splash. They do firing trials. The problem, they know it's going to be heavily fired at by 303 or whatever the enemy's machine gun, lower, smaller caliber weaponry is going to be fired at this all the time. When the bullet hits, the molten core splashes and can find its way through gaps in the armour. So again, there's tests are done to try and find ways of stopping any ingress of bullet splash going through, especially around where the hatch is for the driver. They add extra metal strips are actually added there and across the front as well to try and stop bullets skidding up. For the first time, we've got a cast turret on top of the vehicle to house the machine gun. It's only going to have a two-man crew, commander in the top, driver in the front, and that cast turret will carry a .303 machine gun or a .50 machine gun. And that .50 does actually have an armour-piercing capability that you can go through about 10, 12 millimetres of armour plate. So it's not completely ineffectual. They don't make as many with the .50 Vickers machine gun in though, and they tend to be the ones with the heavier machine gun on. They're the section leaders tank when they're issued to the various troops, the what ends up 3 main regiments that are going to use the Matilda I. It passes through a number of different stages on development. You can see alterations done to the suspension, to the stowage, etc. 1937, again, slightly left field. Here comes another worry, mines. So they look at putting something called the Coulter mine plough onto this vehicle, and that causes a change. They're already starting to produce a vehicle, causes change in some of the things you can see on the vehicle itself. The Coulter mine plough, it's basically, it looks like it's a big framework that is lifted in the air over the top of the tank. It has got a winch on the back coming off the engine, so they have a little tunnel put on the rear of the vehicle that has a drive shaft out the rear. That then will be able to turn a winch which will lift the mine plough clear of the ground or drop it down, pivoted, 4 bolts on the side, an arm comes out to hold where that mine plough will drop down. And the idea there, it is literally ploughing for mines. It is the ploughshares, as it were, go through the ground and turn the mine over to the side. You don't actually explode them, you try and put them out the way. So it turns out that about half the tanks are actually fitted to take Fowler mine ploughs, but we've got no evidence they were ever used in France in 1940 in action. So again, it was something that was just put there, I wouldn't say in case, but you can see it's changed some of the features on the vehicle, where stowage goes, etc. Now the vehicle, it's got exposed tracks on the side. You can see this, they do start again during the production run. You can almost see sort of early models, interim models, late models with slight changes. Small track guards are put at the rear, but that's one of the first things people commented on with these vehicles was how exposed the track and the suspension units actually are. Drive is at the back. The actual, originally on the prototype, they did put a sprocketed idler wheel at the front. They changed that in the production vehicles. But that Ford V8 engine is really driving through to the sprockets at the rear there. It can get you, you know, they work out about 5 miles cross country, 8 miles top speed on the road. There is a governor put on the engine. It could go a bit faster if wanted, but they decide to stop the crews trying to rattle the things apart if they go too fast in this. They can get about 80 miles range going across country on this. That's about 130 kilometres in that sort of area. So it's not going to go far, but again, back to its role, this is not the exploitation vehicle. This is that vehicle that's going to lead the infantry onto the attack. 60 of the vehicles, the first order goes in 1937. In the end, that's upped to, we get 139 production vehicles and that one prototype, so about 140 A11s are actually built all told. So even though we're saying about larger numbers, we're still not really seeing huge quantities of this first infantry tank being built. And by 39, there are some bits of paperwork that almost seem to indicate they already realise this tank has been superseded by its sister vehicle, the A12, the Matilda II tank, which is seen as a much better option as it starts coming into production. So you could argue, even when this goes to war in 1940, some people are very heavily critical, saying it's obsolete. And that really is all about firepower, because as we realised quite quickly in the Second World War, armour protection, yes, of course, it's important, mobility is important, but that idea of a guns versus armour race, it's that gun power that is what people tend to concentrate on during the actual main part of the war. Now, we've got here on the front of the vehicle about 65 millimetres, 60 millimetre on that casting. When you look at the tank from the front, the actual casting for the mantlet is slightly offset to the right, and that's so the commander inside can get at the feed mechanism for the Vickers slightly easier. They look at putting the machine guns, the ZB-53, the machine gun that becomes the Beezer. They try fitting that in there at one point as well in the late 30s. It won't quite fit because of the nature of where the various components fit that way. They won't fit inside that casting that protects the 50 or the 303 caliber machine gun. So they give up on that one. So you really are talking about the only weaponry here is that machine gun, the 303, on most of the vehicles. And on the sides, they give them smoke dischargers. Most of these are made from cut-down Lee Enfield rifles. Again, you lean out or you pull a lanyard, and that would fire the trigger to actually put out a smoke pot to hide your position if needs be on that way. One of the advantages we have here at the Tank Museum, of all 140 Matilda I tanks, or the A11s, we are actually lucky enough. We've actually got one hull that came off a firing range full of holes and 2 other Matilda I tanks. This is one of them. It's been painted up as it would have been in 1940 with a name. It wasn't actually Demon, but it's Demon on the front there, a 4th Royal Tank Regiment tank. And I just thought it would be interesting to have a closer look at this one if we walk around it. Some of that detailing that just shows some of its development story, etc. as well. So first of all, the markings on it. If we look here, we've got this what's called an arm of service marking. The 4 with the white band across the top, arm of service, it gives away the fact that this is actually part of the 1st armoured tank brigade that was in France in 1940. The name given by the crews or the regiment, again from the point of view, 4th letter of the alphabet, therefore 4RTR, so the names follow on that way. And you'll see these odd shapes. Sometimes they're on the front of the bins here, sometimes a whole square of this section, sometimes a little patch, sometimes on the roofs as well. That's anti-gas paint. And the worry in 1940 is if gas is used, that colour will change if gas is present to red. So it's got to be somewhere the driver or the commander can see it and understand there's a problem there, get your gas mask on, we're under a gas attack as well. Of course, we know that that's not actually used in the Second World War. We know this is a late production A11 because the shape of the bins, the earlier ones, the bins are lower down, so these are much more upright. Some tanks you'll see serving in 1940 in France have no bins fitted at all. We can also see there's this extra bar put across the front which is to stop bullet splash going further up. These are to stop bullet splash. So if you can imagine enemy rounds coming in, it's to block that round from skidding up and perhaps going through the visor or taking out the periscope above there. So you've got these fitted. And on the later model vehicles as well, this vision port is slightly offset from the tank's point of view to the right. So it's slightly that way, just as the machine gun is slightly offset as well to the right-hand side, so the commander there. And this, which would normally house a periscope with a canvas cover that was rubberized canvas to stop the water coming in, that's actually slightly offset to the other side, again, to allow the driver's head to maneuver between the two ways he can look out here. As we move round to the side of the vehicle, you can just see here, this big long hinge, that's the driver's hatch. Now the turret has to be traversed for the hatch to be opened, and normally this vehicle would be driven with that driver's hatch fully raised. It's actually so heavy it has to have 2 piston supports to actually hold that up because the weight of it above his head is just too great otherwise. So the turret will always be offset, turned to the side when they're driving along most of the time, only closed down when they're going into action that way. Other things we notice, Chinese eye painted on the tank, that indicates it's a 4th Royal Tank Regiment vehicle. That dates back to the First World War, where a Chinese businessman in Singapore came up with the money to pay for a First World War British tank, and he insisted that that tank has to have eyes to see where it's going. And the regiments continue that tradition to this very day. 4RTR, that's the indicator there, and it's now one of the other squadrons still uses it. T number on the side, that'll be its actual military registration. Tanks are given Ts at the front of them. On that side, there is a civilian road registration quite often put on there. Again, when they move over to France, most of the civilian registrations are taken off. Sometimes you'll see the vehicle with another chalk number on. That's just part of its loading arrangements when it's being shipped across the channel. The white squares, 9-inch white square, put on these tanks in 1940 in France because we just didn't want the risk of not knowing if that tank coming down the road is one of ours or the enemy's. So all British tanks are given this 9-inch square white patch on the side. It's on the rear, it's on the roof, on the front as well. It's a recognition to be able to show that this is one of our tanks that was done at the time. As we move along, you can see the various fixtures, baffle plates. This is to go over the engine in particularly cold weather. So just as we come to the rear of the vehicle, again, we can see this is one of the later production vehicles. They took the stowage off the back here and replaced it in other places. That's because they needed to put a shaft to go through to the engine and here comes a power takeoff that here fitted on the rear would be a winch that then has cables to be able to lift up and down the Coulter mine plough if it was actually fitted on there. Again, you can see the white square, different vehicles, they've got that white recognition square in different places on the vehicle. Rear of the turret, quite often you have the section commander shape. Sometimes it's a diamond, it's a square or a circle, so you're helping to identify where that particular tank fits within the unit. And one last little point I always think is amazing where you look in detail at some of these vehicles. If we just look here at the maker's plate, it says infantry tank Mark I. It's got this serial number, the date it was made, actually finished March 1940, that T number 8106. But all of this has been chiseled out so that you can't see where it was made, because we didn't want a captured tank that the Germans would understand this is made at a Vickers factory, and quite often that would actually have the address on, and we see it on a number of other of our vehicles. So it's a lovely little nuance, a little point that shows when this vehicle and the problems they had at that time, we really didn't want a captured tank, indicating where our tank factories were. When this tank's first designed, it doesn't have the space for a radio. But by the time it's going into manufacture at the end of the 1930s, now the whole of the tank corps is realising for command and control, flag signals, fantastic, do that over radio silence, but we really want every vehicle to actually have a radio installed. So the number 11 radio set is given to each Matilda tank, and pretty much everyone that goes to France is now kitted out with a radio. It is a large radio, and the space, the only place they can find to put this radio set is behind the driver in the front on the floor beneath the commander's position. So the commander's got to squat down to try and work that radio to get it to work that way. But they thought that was worthwhile, even in the relatively cramped space that A11 had back then. Now the radio is an important one because these tanks, the two regiments that actually see action in France in 1940, 4th RTR has about 50 Matilda I tanks. It goes out there in late 39, and it's joined later on in the spring of 1940 by 7 RTR. So the two regiments are out there. 7 RTR is about 27 of the Matilda I tanks, and they put them with Matilda II tanks in both units. And that makes something called the 1st Army Tank Brigade. And those units are actually originally scheduled to go into Belgium. They drive that way to meet the supposed German advance in May of 1940. They come back, they're formed together near Arras in France, and they do a flank attack against the advancing German panzer column, 7th Panzer Division, as it races in a route south of Arras heading to the sea. Now, I've talked about this battle in other tank chats or another talk on that battle, so have a look at that one to see the fuller picture of that story and its significance, because just briefly here, what that tank attack does by not that many Matilda I and Matilda II tanks panics the German military. They think they are being intercepted on their vulnerable flank by many more tanks than are actually there. Hitler gets the message and stops his advance of the German panzers. They've already reached the coast. There is a chance if they kept going on the 24 hours that they'd been officially stopped by Hitler, if they kept going, they'd have gone straight up the coast, and that would have meant that we, the British Army, would have had nowhere to evacuate their army across back to Britain. So on that night of the attack, Britain reinforces Boulogne, Calais and Dunkirk, and therefore we've got a route out for our army to retreat to. And again, if you look at that in that bigger picture, these tanks are part of what seems a minor battle, but has enormous influence on European history. As many historians have pointed out, at that moment, it meant we could save an army. That meant Churchill did not have to negotiate with Hitler. He'd still got a navy and air force, don't forget, but if he hadn't gotten an army, he'd have been in such a worse position. The fact we could save all those men from the beaches of Dunkirk meant we could fight on in that way. And of course, the crews in that tank attack from the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiment, they know nothing of this. They don't know where they fit in that bigger picture of European history. And they come off at the end of the day, barely 20 tanks are remaining after that attack. But it has enormous importance. So going back to, even though we can be perhaps a little scathing about the Matilda 1, it's a cheap tank, built in not great numbers, but it's there to try and fill a role. It's almost laughed at by some, because look at it, just one machine gun, exposed suspension, etc., picked on in a certain sort of way, sees no further action after that summer of 1940 with the British Army. It's about 70 left back in the UK. They're used for training, maybe defence, but we then move on straight away to Matilda 2, etc., and we don't build any more of these tanks. But look what it did. So that, for me, is one of those ones. So the stories behind some of those vehicles, surely that's one of the things we should be interested in, because, again, as we always say, top trumps, yeah, it's got thick armour, really impressive, frightens Hitler later on. He reports 37mm anti-tank guns bouncing off this thick armour, Matilda 1s, Matilda 2s. That starts that Tiger programme he gets going on. So it has effects in other areas. But for me, go back, look at that Arras 1940 battle, how a small tank force literally changes history. Now, I just want to point out one thing here as well, that not everyone loves this. And when I was reading through the reports put together after the war, they were trying to summarise some of the lessons from the different tank programmes. 1947, and I found this rather jaundiced view by one officer who was asked to comment. And he said, this is all about Matilda 1. In this connection, therefore, mention might be made of the vulnerability of the tracks and the suspension of the Mark I tank, in view of the fact that this tank was designed to go bald-headed for the known opposition, and that it was seriously handicapped by having no main armament, a crew of only 2, and the only infantry speed it should, I submit, be pointed out that it was really a most unsatisfactory tank, and it wasn't such a big stride forward as the notes on the file seem to imply. This sort of tank, and indeed the idea of an AFE without a gun, was severely criticised by many thinking tank officers at the time, and I think it should be brought out as a lesson for posterity that it doesn't pay in the long run to save a few £1,000s, especially when a potential enemy was producing tanks with a main armament. The Matilda 2, on the other hand, was undoubtedly the best tank in the world at the time it was produced, and if this type of tank had been produced earlier and in greater numbers, there would have been some very great results to show for it in the early part of the war. And these lessons from posterity, here we are in Europe again, that seems to be heading towards, dare I say it, another war. Isn't it interesting how people are trying to do that flag warning? Don't always go for the cheap option, have a little think about it. Sometimes your country's survival might depend on vehicles like this.